Um, thanks for having me. It's a uh, great honor to be here. Okay, so here's table of contents for the presentation. There's a lot of stuff in here, and it's this is there. It's great. I mean, there's a lot. I don't want to overwhelm you with material, but on a lot of the slides, there's more material than you'll need, and you can email me from all this stuff. And I actually have videos for almost all of these things that are up on YouTube that are just freely available. So the best situation is if there's something where there's a lot of information and you're really excited about it, but it went by too quickly, you could just email me or check out one of those videos on YouTube. This was for a class I taught on animal music, and yeah, it was an amazing adventure. I really enjoyed it. So I hope to sort of lure you into some of this interesting stuff. So the first question we're going to ask is about your musical ancestry, with the question, did humans invent music? We'll look a little bit at a brief history of hearing, asking what sound is and how we hear it. We can then look at vocalizations specifically, and this little idea that if your neighbors can hear you, if they've evolved to be able to hear it, you might as well start to annoy them. How are the various ways of making sounds? What is it like to be a string player or a wind player or a percussion player in the natural world of animals? How can you echolocate if you would like to sing for your dinner? What is a song? What's in a song? How to string sounds together? Once you've been able to string some sounds together, how might you build repertoire by stringing them together in different ways? We'll look at this year's Whale-apalooza, where kindred musical spirits connect from across the globe. Finally, with a question about what human music is, what kind of animal music human animals make. So we're going to start with your musical ancestry, asking, did humans invent music? So it's sometimes said, this is even by scientists, it's sometimes said that humans have been around for 7 million years, something like that, and that isn't really true. I don't know why scientists say that. I kind of understand why the general population says that, but humans have really been around for at least 2 billion years, and probably something more like 4 billion years. So the universe itself formed, the Big Bang happened 13.8 or 13.6 billion years ago, somewhere in there. Our solar system formed 4.5 or 4.6 billion years ago. And it was, some people say like just 4.1 billion years ago, like soon after our solar system formed, there was life. Maybe it's as late as 2.1 billion years ago, but somewhere in there, we've had life on the Earth for at least 2.1 billion years. And those early life forms were your ancestors. You could say, were they human yet 2.1 billion years ago? And the answer is like, no, they weren't. But what we possess inside ourselves is predominantly from these earlier ancestors. So 99% of our genome is shared with chimpanzees. And even if you look at fish or worms, then 70% of our genome is shared with fish and worms. And it's like 65% for birds, because birds are sort of like have changed since dinosaurs, or sorry, since reptiles. This is sort of like a standard timeline if you're looking at humans. There was life, there were eukaryotes with real cells, there were animals, bilateral animals, chordates, vertebrates, jawed fish, bony fish, tetrapods, amniotes, mammals, and then all the different mammals, and then you get primates, and then of all the different primates, you get apes, and of all the different apes, you get humans. That's a way of looking at our history. That's a way of looking at time, or evolutionary, the evolutionary relatedness of species from the perspective of human beings. But it's not really representative. So there isn't really a directed progression this way. you could take any of the animal groups on the upper side of the line: prokaryotes, fungi, sponges, protostomes, teleosts, amphibians. Take any of those, and you could put them at the top of this tree thing as timeline. And then the timeline would just be adapted a little bit, but every single thing of every one of those things is true. All those species that are in the upper side of the diagram, they're all alive today. So they have their own history that's like this. So you don't want to think about evolution as progressively heading towards us. But it is the case that if you're starting with us, you can go backwards along this timeline. This is the human version of the timeline, but it is true that before we were human, I don't know, that 7 million years ago, we had the same characteristics as our shared ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos. And that 10 million years ago, we had all the same characteristics as our shared ancestor with gorillas, and so on. If you go back 63 million years ago, we looked a lot like a tarsier or a strapshireen, a tree shrew. These are like little tiny, and they're not tiny, but they're sort of like early primates. If you go back farther, we looked like a general mammal, a little like maybe like a mouse type mammal. If you go back further, our ancestors, like your grandparents, etc., going back 395 million years, they looked like a salamander, basically. If you go back 400 million years, they looked like fish. So when you're thinking about our psychology today, you can really think in the same way. You can look at these things that I'm holding up, these appendages, and say, those are arms. But like they're also 400 million years ago, these same things were fins. So that's like the physical structure, but you can really think about your psychological structure in the same way. Our social lives, how we use vocalization, how we respond to sound. And so that's kind of what we're looking at today. We're saying, okay, humans certainly did some novel stuff with music that's different from what other animals did. But there is an evolutionary history of how we use sound, how we respond to sound, how we use it, how we structure it. And that's what we're going to look at to try to get an idea of why we make music the way we do today. And what that means socially, what it means emotionally, and what it means cognitively. Okay, so we'll specifically be looking at insects very briefly, some fish, frogs, birds we'll spend a little bit more time with, and then whale and bats I'll be talking about. So we've now talked about our history, evolutionary history, and let's now look at what hearing is. So what's sound? How do we hear sound? So we have this common question: if a tree falls with no one around, does it make a sound? And of course, it depends on what you mean by sound. So what is sound? There's two definitions. One of them would be objective. Sound is a pressure wave. Another one would be a subjective definition. Sound is the detection of a pressure wave. So you get asked this question: if you drop a pebble on the surface of still water, does it produce ripples? And the answer is like, yes, it does, irrespective of whether anyone sees it. So if you produce an impact in the air, or friction, or breakage, when no one's around, you could say, are ripples produced in the air? And the answer is yeah. It's really similar to what you see with the pebble on the water. It just happens in 3 dimensions. And yeah, there's a little picture of what it might look like in 3-dimensional space. So all sounds are produced by actions. We'll look at that in a second, but it can be an impact, like boom. It could be liquid on liquid, like if water is dropping, if there's a drop coming from your faucet landing in a cup with water in it, right? That makes a sound. So water on water, water on solid, solid on solid, rubbing solids against each other like this, breaking. I'm not going to break my fingers to show. Oh, I could crack my knuckles. Yep, there we go. So those sorts of things produce sounds. And therefore, to detect sound is really to perceive some sort of an action or emotion. And of course, that action or emotion can occur from an animate being or an inanimate being, like wind. So let's look a little at the history of how we became sensitive to sound. Not all animals hear. When we were looking at that big timeline before, hearing starts around the time of fish, except insects also evolved the ability to hear, but they did that independently. So on our own timeline, our first ancestors to develop hearing were fish. And I want to start out by saying that hearing in the water is different from hearing on land. Sound travels 5 times more efficiently in the water, so 5 times faster and 5 times further. And those sonic waves, right, it's like the pebble on the surface of the pond, but it's in 3D. Sonic waves in water can be detected by hair cells on the skin. And you can see that so at the top right, there's a picture like very magnified. Those are hair cells in the ear, but those used to be on skin. So a fish would have them. You can see this in the middle of the screen. I'm just gonna move my little window here. You guys can see my mouse, is that right? Was that a yes? Okay. So these are little hair cells. They're inside this thing called a cupola. But basically, I think the hair cells, yes, are in here. They're sticking up. These are canals, water canals, under the scales. And then as water pushes in around there, it's going to tilt the cupola around, and these hair cells then open up channels, and they send neural discharges down here, and that goes to the brain. So that was on the outside of the fish's body, sort of like this. And that's called the lateral line system. And then eventually what happens is, so in fish, most fish can hear just like this. And you can hear very low sounds if they're very loud. You can just feel them on the outside of the body. Some fish become specialists, and they have like air pockets inside them. One of them is in the swim bladder, which we'll see again in a second. And if the swim bladder is touching the ear, where you've got these hair cells, then this swim bladder can amplify the pressure waves. And that's a way to develop hearing, special hearing as a fish. But, so some fish have evolved that, but the fish that went up onto land didn't evolve that. So they had to re-evolve hearing by taking the hair cells that were on the outside of the body, pushing them down in with like an air chamber outside of it. And that's what happens with our ear. We have hair cells in the cochlea, and the air chamber is the tympanum of the ear. So that tympanum actually evolved a bunch of different times, once in amphibians, once or twice or 3 times in reptiles, and then once in mammals. And you have to have that to hear in air, because air, you don't get particle movement along the surface of your skin. You have to develop a sort of pressure thing to amplify stuff for hearing on land. Okay, so in any event, when a motion in the air or in the water causes the air to vibrate, then our eardrums will then vibrate sympathetically with the airborne vibration and then translate it into neural signals through these hair cells. So that's how hearing works. And we could say, why would you want to hear? And the answer is that the first reason you want to hear is that hearing, for predator defense, you can hear if you're about to get eaten. That seems to be the first reason that fish and other animals started hearing. But then once you can hear, or once your fellow species members can hear, you can start making noise and influencing their behavior. So that's why you're going to want to vocalize. So we tend to think of music and speech as being expressive, and they are, but they're also manipulative. And this may be the more primordial function of music and speech, of noise making. Manipulation does not have to mean malicious intent. So you might say that a mother would be trying to manipulate her baby into falling asleep with a sweet lullaby. It is good for the mother, but it's good for the baby to be able to be helped to sleep. And that's obviously use of music, of sound to manipulate someone else's behavior. Once hearing evolves in a species for predator detection, communication often follows shortly behind. So it is kind of rare to find animals that can hear, but that don't also communicate. And what you use communication for, you can use it to allure others, right? Like to seduce them, to cooperate with them, or to threaten them. I said that kind of happily. Let me say that. Or to threaten them. Okay. Now it just sounds like I was threatening you, but that's okay. Let's take a listen. This is a midshipman toadfish. It sings about 100 hertz. It has a swim bladder. I think you see it on a later screen, but the swim bladder is kind of, it's like it's homologous to our lung. It's an air sac, and they shake it at about 100 times a second, and that produces 100 hertz tone. And it uses this to attract females, and the females are only attracted to it when they're in the right part of their cycle, when they've produced eggs that they're ready to be laid. Then they hear the hum and they go hang out with the male, and they go into his little nest, and then they lay them inside. So just give a little listen. I know it looks awful. He bites her on the head a couple times, and he can't sing while he's biting her. And then he actually kind of like tries to trap her in his little house, but then she decides she wants to stay, and then she lays eggs, and then he takes care of the eggs forever. There's some, so I didn't get into this in the presentation, but there's really, really, really fascinating stuff with sex and gender in fish, in frogs, in animal vocalization across species. It's sort of stereotypical. It's sort of stereotypical in the scientific literature for a song to be written about as if it's just produced by males. And that was one of the things that we really found was really cool about really going into detail about songs in all different kinds of species. Really, how fascinating the gender and sex dynamic can be. And there's a lot of sex change things happen in fish. There's somehow like 1/5 of reef species of fish change from one sex to the other at some point in their life. And there are aspects of that with frogs too, where it's just the temperature at which the eggs are laid determines what the sex is going to be. So, just for the future, if you're curious about that, you can even email me about it. Let's talk now about how animals make sounds. So there's 4 basic ways. One of them is turbulence. So an example of this is whispering, sending air up through my mouth, and then I'm shaping it a little bit. Whistling is the same thing. I'm just shaping it really, really finely so that you get a tone. Fluttered tongue in flute is like this as well. So we'll get into the actual flute in a second, but let's say I have a tone, it's going to sing a tone, but then if I flutter while I'm doing it, I'm creating turbulence in the airstream. So I have a very fast frequency, which is the tone I'm singing, and then I have a slow frequency of creating turbulence in the air, and that's creating the flutter tone. In speech, our sibilants, s and sh, and our fricatives, th and f, those things are created through turbulence in the airstream. There's also this concept of explosions and implosions. So in speech, this is easy to think about the k, p, and t. Those are plosives. And I was trying to figure out about implosions, and we seem to not do that as much, but that is an implosion, and a click is an implosion. And those are used in some languages. They're just not used in English very much. Transients, they're really just things banging into each other. Frictions, fractures, percussions. Now, excitations of resonance, this becomes probably the most interesting of all these for music. What happens is you have energy from a non-fluctuating source. This is like when I was blowing before, converted into a rapid fluctuation. So if I had a flute here, I would just blow a non-fluctuating, there's no vibration speed there that I'm blowing with the flute, but it's getting pulled down into the flute, and the length of the pipe is determining the way in which the air can come in, go out, come in and go out, come in and go out. So the flute is allowing a resonance of a certain sort. So I'm putting noise into the flute, and it's then exciting a resonance inside the flute. And that is the same way, stridulation, like playing a violin, is the same way you put a finger on a string, you bow the string, you're putting noise energy into the string basically, but it's allowing only one frequency to be the main resonance. And then singing is like this. And singing is, for animal communication, it's the main thing. Helmholtz from the 19th century said that the voice is just by far the most complex, nuanced, sophisticated instrument that we know of. And I really like that way of thinking about it. So, let me go back here. I think we look more at this on a later screen, but this is just like a general larynx, and frogs have this. So fish don't have it, but frogs, birds, kind of, let's ignore birds, frogs, reptiles, mammals, they all have this. They send air through this way. It's going through the folds, and the tension, muscles here and here, and I don't know, maybe here, like pull these things. So there's a certain amount of tension. So as air goes through, these guys get forced open and then snap back. And according to how much tension there is, that's the rate that they're going to snap back. So that is a case of sending air through a thing, and that's going to create a resonance. So that's excitation of resonance. But then additionally, you're going to have one tube above the larynx, that's in the throat, and a second tube above it in the mouth. And you shape those things to create the two different formants, the two areas of resonance that bring out the difference between your vowels, like ah, all those things. You're shaping the sound with those two different tubes. So I think we look at more in detail of that in a quick second, but let's first look at insects. So insects can make sounds in a couple of different ways, but a main one is called stridulation. And here we're going to see an example of a cricket doing this. Stridulation is rubbing one part of the body over the ridged edge of another, just like a bow and a violin string. And here is a video. This is the mole cricket. Okay, now that's normal speed. That's what this is going to be half speed. And you'll start to hear the individual pulses. I jump to quarter speed, or let's see. Yeah, this is less than quarter speed. Sorry. That's 1/8 speed, and I'm going to go even to 1/16 speed. Okay. So you can hear how the is made composed of smaller little things. Here's how the fish make sounds in about 3 different ways. Um, you call it vocalization, and you'll see why, I think, at the end of this slide. The way the midshipman does it is it has a swim bladder, and like I said, our lungs come from the swim bladder of a fish, and the swim bladder is a thing that, like, the fish fills it with air if it wants to go higher up in the water column, and it gets rid of the air if it wants to go lower down. But then, so eventually, and gas exchange for the fish, how it breathes is usually happens with the gills. But eventually, as fish develop lungs to go up, spend more time outside of water on land, they start doing gas exchange with the swim bladder. So anyway, they have these muscles on the swim bladder that can shake it, and that can produce a tone like we saw with the midshipman. There's 2 other ways that they do it, and I think these are a little bit less common, but I'm not sure. They can stridulate their pectoral fins. So the pectoral fins are the ones, those are comparable to our arms. So they are either rubbing against them like this, or they're rubbing them like this. I'm not sure. But basically, they're rubbing the fins against one another. And this I can't demonstrate, but they have some bones in the back of their head that can bang against each other and produce sound. So it's just like, how can you produce sound? If you can produce sound in any way, you can use it to communicate with your fellow fish. So unlike other vertebrates, fish don't use their respiratory apparatus to sing because they don't use lungs to breathe. And that they, since they don't have any muscles to bring in air and then push it out, they don't have anything to push air over a larynx type thing. So that they are different from other vertebrates in that way. The rest of the vertebrates do produce vocalization by pushing air out through either the larynx or the syrinx. So say, why are we calling this singing? And the answer is fish singing is homologous to tetrapod singing at the level of brainstem. And I found that to be totally fascinating when I learned about it. But it's the same nuclei that control the voice in the brainstem. Sorry, the nuclei that control the voice in, like, our brainstem, those same nuclei control the shaking of the swim bladder in singing fish. So it's not really metaphorical to call it vocalization. It just means the larynx isn't the same as the swim bladder, but the thing that controls it is the same. Okay, birds are going to be kind of similar to us in that they use lungs to push, to power the flow of air over vibrating membranes, right, like our vocal cords. But those membranes are just not the larynx. They have a larynx, but they don't use it to sing, I think is how it works. Instead, they get those vibrations at the joint between the lungs and the trachea, and that thing is called the syrinx. And if you notice, they have 2 of them. So birds, a large percentage of birds, and maybe all of them, can produce 2 different sounds at once. And I know this is going to blow your mind. Like, I'm worried about blowing your mind too much. But I'm going to take the risk if you guys are ready to go with me. This okay, I know that didn't blow your mind yet. You're like, I've heard a bird before. It's the wood thrush. So what this author did, Donald Kreutzma, is he put microphones next to each syrinx, recorded them separately. So what you're going to hear now is he's going to play it a lot slower. You're going to hear one of the syrinxes first in isolation, then the other one, and then both of them together. And this is 10 times slower. See, I know I blew your mind. I'm going to play the full speed again. Okay. So for me, that's so fast that I just hear, it's just birdsong. No offense to birds. But when you hear this, you can hear, oh, it's very precise. It's musical. They're using, real live everyday musical instrument intervals, and there's actually like a counterpoint going on. The slow version. Cool. Okay. Now, some of you may be thinking, I know like you guys are students, and you might be looking for an extra job on the side. And if you're a singer at all, you might think like, how could I get my singing behavior to pay off? If you could learn to echolocate, you could at least eat bugs. So here is a little overview of that, just in case this is of interest to you. In reality, I know you're thinking like echolocation, sure, it uses the voice, it's interesting, but there's no way it's going to have anything to do with music. But let me make the argument that it does. Echolocation seems like it's so practical. It's even more practical than speaking. How could we learn something about music from echolocation? You might say, like, where is the artistry in learning about echolocation? The example of echolocation demonstrates functional differences between frequency ranges in a context other than communication. High frequencies are actually very small. If you look at the bottom of this chart, the C13, it's much higher than our piano. So C8 is the highest note on the piano. That's 4,000 hertz, and it's about, the wavelength is actually about 8 centimeters long. But if you went up very high into the, sorry, you know what? It's supposed to be 130 or 134 kilohertz. But if you went up into that ultrasonic range, you would get a much, much, much smaller wavelength. So high frequencies are very small. They only travel very short distances. Low frequencies are actually very large. The lowest, that may be supposed to be C1. That low C on the piano is over 10 meters big. So, I don't know, it's close to like 30 feet. So it's pretty big. If you are listening to which of your sounds echo and when, you can determine both what is out there and where it is. Let me just say, like, if you have a really, really, really low frequency and you want to wait for its echo to bounce off, it has to bounce off something bigger than the size of the wave. So if you have a 33 hertz sound, it can bounce off a building or it could bounce off a whale, but it would go right through or around a human being. This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I hope you guys can enjoy it. Do you want, so echolocation, how-to guide for the aspiring hand-flapping moth eater. Why do I call it hand-flapping? It's because birds, like their wings are their whole arms, but bats, their wings are actually their fingers. They just have these enormous fingers and webbed things, and they fly like that effectively. Do you want to use your voice to avoid obstacles and catch prey? Do you want to use your ears to see in the dark? Try echolocation. All you need is a high-pitched voice and a pair of fuzzy ears. Why high pitch? Low sounds have large wavelengths and only bounce back off large objects. So unless you plan to eat a buffalo or a salmon, you gotta get squeaky. We recommend vocalizations between 14,000 and 100,000 hertz. The higher the sound you make, the smaller its wavelength, for the finer the grain of detail returned to you in the form of an echo. And I'm gonna skip some of these things. Does this mean that I will receive echoes during echolocation? Yes, it does. In fact, you already receive echoes all the time, but currently you may be ignoring these echoes rather than using them to your advantage. Echolocation teaches you to produce a sound based on the type of echo you want to hear, and then how to listen for exactly that specific echo. By listening to the sound you hear returning to you, you can determine not only that an object is nearby, but also what texture it is and how fast it is moving. All that with a squeaky voice and a furry pair of ears. But how does it work? Why can't I just sing however I like? If you want to just sing, go ahead. But if you want to sing for your dinner, you need to do it right. The kind of note you sing determines the kind of information you receive as feedback from your intended audience. If you produce very short pulses of sound, you can listen for the timing of each echo between pulses. This tells you how far away your audience is. If you produce a longer, more continuous sound, you will still be singing as your echo is returning to you, but don't worry, as long as you keep the note you're singing constant, you can compare the pitch of the returning echo with the pitch of the note you originally sang, which you're still singing. And this will tell you how fast your little intended audience is flying away from you relative to your own speed of approach. And this is because as you approach your own echo, you progress through its waves at a faster rate than they would wash over you if you were stationary, and this effectively raises their frequency by about half a semitone. Now, I know that's very complex. I'm going to act out some bat echolocation for you. So this is the Mexican free-tailed bat, and we'll see a song from it in a second. So the bat, here's a little insect, and here is the bat. So the first thing the bat is going to do, like insects is flying around, and the bat is here, and it's going to have these sweeps. It's going to go, this is obviously very high, much higher than it can do, and very, very loud, but we can't hear it at all. So it's doing those sweeps, and if the thing is, this size, and it does a sweep in this direction, and it hears back an echo, it can hear the size of the thing that it bounced back off of, right? And so it knows roughly where it is. Then the bat will transition to I think it's a constant, a constant tone. So it's got a frequency that matches the size of the thing it's looking for, and it's flying this way. And if the insect is this way, it's flying this way, it's coming after it. And so if we pretend the insect isn't moving, then the bat is getting closer to the it's hitting. So it's going, but as its sound waves come back and bounce back, the bat is progressing through the sound waves more rapidly. So frequency is actually higher, and by higher by about a semitone. So it can sing its tone and listen to the echo as it comes back, and it will hear a dissonance. It'll hear, a minor second. It'll hear dissonance, basically, and that lets it know that it's catching up on its prey. If the prey is going farther away, then it just knows it can't catch it because it's probably flying as fast as it can anyway. And then at the very end, I think it starts pulsing, and it's listening to the timing of the bounce back of the echoes, and then it catches it. And interestingly, I was surprised by this, but it doesn't catch it in its mouth. Here's the insect. It'll come and it'll do a somersault around it and catch it in its little pouch. And the reason why is because the bat's got to still be vocalizing to continue flying. You can't just like start eating and then boom and into a tree or some other bat. Okay. Going back into the screen share. Let's look at songs. So far, we've done a lot of stuff with sound and hearing. So you want to string sounds together in time. A very simple sound is the midshipman song. That's just like one long hum. Still a very simple song is to just have two sounds, and you might just call it a call as opposed to a song. But most frogs, I think, have just two sounds. A bird, lots of birds have this. Insects, those crickets, we listened to a cricket that was stridulating, but another crickets go chukik, 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 that kind of thing. Like those are two sounds. Here's a Tungara frog. Okay, those two different sounds, it could do the call with just one or the other. One of them is to attract females, and one of them is to sort of like deter other males. And there is really some complex communication that goes on, but you can hear it's just two different sounds. Then you can have a more complex song, but one that's just stereotypical. So that's the zebra finch. That zebra finch will pretty much always sing that song. It's more complex than a non-song vocalization than just two notes, but it's pretty much always the same. And birds are interesting when we start looking at songs because the reptiles, amphibians, fish, they all just have innate songs if they have songs at all. But birds learn their songs. And the zebrafinch can't learn anybody else's song. It can only learn the zebrafinch song. But it does have to hear its song at least once at the right time in its life for it to learn that song. And then there's other birds with much more complex song learning abilities. So some of them will look at a Bengali finch that has something called a finite state grammar, which you model with a transition diagram. I know that sounds fancy, but we'll look at a Bengali finch song and we'll see how it takes a bunch of syllables and strings them together to make new songs. And then there are some animals that can learn or create new syllables. And I think I really do have to play for you this a lyrebird singing.
What bird has the most elaborate, the most complex, and the most beautiful song in the world? Well, I guess there are lots of contenders, but this bird must be one of them. The superb lyrebird of southern Australia.
He clears a space in the forest to serve as his concert platform. To persuade females to come close and admire his plumes, he sings the most complex song he can manage, and he does that by copying the songs of all the other birds he hears around him, such as the kookaburra. It's a very convincing impersonation. Even the original is fooled. He can imitate the calls of at least 20 different species. He also, in his attempt to outsing his rivals, incorporates other sounds that he hears in the forest. That was a camera shutter. And again. And now a camera with a motor drive. And that's a car alarm. And now the sounds of foresters and their chainsaws working nearby.
Yep, I can't believe it either. Yeah. Okay, so let me take you into the zebrafinch. Now, here's the zebrafinch here at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to show you the screen, but don't worry about this. This is this very amazing article that went into analyzing all the different types of sounds, not just the songs that zebrafinches make. And so you don't have to worry because, you know, there's just way too many words there. But I am going to play for you some of these other sounds, and then you can hear their song. So this is the begging call. Here's a long tonal call. Right? This is just to give you an idea of different sounds. It makes the whine, and the whine is very quiet. You can't hear it. Wait. Here's the nesting song. Tet, the distance call. And here's so the slightly different for females and males. Here's the whist call and the distress call. Okay. And two more, the thuck call and a tuck call. Oops. Okay, I messed up. But so now those are the different sounds that zebrafinch makes, and they have a complex social life. You sometimes don't recognize them when you read just about their song. So here's their song, and then we're going to slow it down. Zebrafinch. Okay, so let's slow it down. I think this is a different zebrafinch singing, but don't let that trouble you. Oh, maybe it is the same one. Okay, here it is slowed down. Even slower now. Okay, now if I pause it there, I know that what you were thinking is, no way, that's definitely someone talking. Am I right? Let's even listen. If you listen even slower, it sounds like someone talking. Okay. So we can, return to the implications of that later. Let's talk about, so now that you have one song, the zebrafinch learns just, sorry, was that, was there a question? No.
Oh.
No. Okay. So zebrafinch just learn a single song. They just learn the song that they're hearing when they're growing up. And I think like they could learn, yeah, anyway. But some birds create songs. And like when we're thinking about musical composition or improvisation, we can learn presumably from birds. It's at least an interesting comparative exercise. So musical improvisation, if you meet someone who says they're an improviser, we tend to think that's miraculous. And like it is, I don't want to say it's not, but we improvise when we speak sentences all the time. One powerful way of generating an unlimited supply of novel utterances is to rely on what's called a finite state grammar. And like that's just a fancy term, don't worry about it too much. All it's really going to mean is that the choices that you make as you're going from one syllable to the next could be modeled by a diagram sort of like the one that you have up at the right. And the reason I brought up speech and music is because we do the same things with speech and music. You will often want to, you can model words, you can model chords, notes with the same kind of thing. So up at the right, you have zebrafinches and Bengalese finches. And I think, the zebrafinch is the lighter one, Bengalese finch is the darker one. So zebrafinches only learn a slow song, Bengalese finches learn a kind of formula for improvising. What is this formula? Is it a syntax? How are these two different types of recipe for song production? How do they compare with different types of human music making and learning? So let's listen to, sorry, we're not listening yet. It's easy to account for the encoding of a single stereotype song, like in the zebrafinch. In mind brain, that can, sorry, it's easier to account for a single song, like in the zebrafinch, than it is to account for the ability to generate an infinite number of possible songs, flexible songs, through syntactic recombination, like you get with the Bengalese finch, which we're about to hear. In the zebrafinch, the learning of a single stereotype song could be accounted for by a simple serial or linear model. You have syllable A, syllable B, syllable C, syllable D, and you just have to show how once it sings A, it can sing B, and once it sings B, it sings C, etc. That's not super hard. In the Bengalese finch, there are numerous possibilities for continuation from each individual note or syllable, but the possibilities are at the same time not unlimited. So you could start with something like this, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, but then A can go to either B or I, B can go to either D or J, C doesn't go to D, it actually goes F, etc. There's some things, and this is me reconstructing the diagram that you have at the upper right, but we're going to actually listen to a real Bengalese finch song and construct our own diagram. So here it is Bengalese finch, closely related to the zebra finch at normal speed. So you might have heard some repetition in there. We can look in more detail. Here is like the first phrase at much slower rate, and I've labeled the different motives. Okay. Then the next phrase, right? These are just parts of that full song that you heard before. Now, I've put all the phrases together and I've labeled the parts. Looks like my letters are overlapping a little bit. I'm sorry. But so this is going to be the slow version of the original song you heard, and I've just labeled the different syllables. Okay. Now on the screen, this is a very complex slide, but I'm going to tell you what is happening here. What I did is I took the song that I just recorded, that we just looked at, and I tried to drive my own diagram like this. So I just labeled the syllables in order, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I first looked at each syllable, how often it occurs. So that's called your zero order probability. Just on its own, how many A's were there, how many B's, how many C's, etc. Then I looked at every time there's an A, how often is the next syllable an A? How often is it a B? How often is it a C? So A most frequently goes to another A. So like A, and 7 times. It goes to B once in this whole song, it goes to C twice, etc. That's how this works. And then I looked at the second order probabilities. If you have AC, it interestingly, it always goes to E. If you have C, if you go from C to D and then E to D, then you will always go to another D. I worked out those things. And then the one thing that jumps out also is that every little subphrase seems to end with this E, F, F, G, G, E, F, F, G, G. And you end up hearing burp, burp. That's what it ends up sounding like. So you could do this with human music, you could do this with human speech as well. And this isn't just random. It probably means there's a kind of brain wiring that allows the animal to generate novel songs in a kind of unlimited way. So I'm going to skip over bats and we're going to go right to bats also have a transition diagram like this, but that's very simple. Let's head into whales, and then we'll get to a conclusion. That's right. Specifically, we're talking about humpback whales. So I think you read a chapter by Catherine Payne, and like when I read this chapter, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, I just fell in love with it. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how complex whale song was. So what Payne helps you see, so she and her husband followed along whales for a long time and were recording them and analyzing them. And her writing on it is the best that I've seen. Okay, so at the highest level, you've got a song. Songs are composed of different themes. Those themes are composed of phrases. Those phrases are composed of two subphrases, and then there's notes or units within each subphrase. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but the song itself can be 10 to 20 minutes long, but then they keep repeating them over and over for up to 36 hours, which seems like a very long time to sing, can constantly sing the same song over and over again. There are 10 or fewer themes per song. The themes are always in the same order. A phrase is a grouping of any two subphrases, and phrases, there can be different numbers of phrases each time the person or each time the whale sings the song. Subphrases, there's always two per phrase. Sorry, was that a no? Okay. For subphrases, there's a single note or phoneme that's looped any number of times. And so those notes tend to be between 30 hertz, which is as low as we can hear, and 4,000 hertz. That's like the lowest note on the piano and the highest note of the piano. And then the duration of the notes can be from like 1/8 of a second to 8 seconds. And then sometimes they're pure tones, tone bursts, and modulated frequency contours. That means like the frequency changes across it. And then these songs evolve. So if you take any two populations of humpback whales, you'll see that there's differences between them, and that's the same with like some bats. But I didn't show you those. Then within any one individual, his singing of the song 1 year or 1 month will differ from the way he's singing that same song at a later time. And then there's changes in the length of the units, number of units, the repetitions of phrases, and the presence of themes. So just briefly, some examples. I'm not going to go into this in detail. These are from the Catherine Payne chapter. But here you see subphrase 1 on the left and subphrase 2. And over the course of 5 years, subphrase 1 kind of goes like, and then the next year it's, it's hard to see how that's the same, but and then so you can see over 5 years, the whale is still doing the same thing, but it has mutated. And then the same with subphrase 2. It's going from like to and then right over 5 years. And she, sorry. This is an example of R's being replaced by J's. This shows you statistics. The R is like, and the J is, and you can see that progression evolution over time, and that's over the course of, that's from 1 month to the next, as opposed to years. And we'll just skip this one, and we'll skip rhyming and alliteration too. If we still have a minute, I would like to just give you, Tony, do we have another 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's 5 after 2. So
Okay.
this is great. Just keep going.
Okay. So Roger Payne is married to Catherine, or he at least was. And his recording of the songs inspired the Save the Whales movement. It's one of the most important like Earth awareness like global warming awareness kind of situations, or the damage that humans do to the earth. Um, so there's more on that in the future if you want to look up. There's some great podcasts with him. But this is a song that he recorded, I think, back in the 70s or 80s by a whale. I'm going to play it first at normal speed, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm just going to play the first phrase up to the big gray bar. My mouse is where we are. Okay. Now I'm going to play it at quadruple speed, and we might get through the whole thing. We'll see. But you can hear the structure. It sounds like birdsong, and it's clearly structured when you play it at really fast speed. You can hear it's like an intelligent animal. It's designed something. Okay, so when you hear that, you can hear the similarity from that whale and other animals, and you can also hear that there's a pattern, there's a structure, especially since it repeats that same thing over and over, and so do other whales. So, sorry, I'm gonna just do one last one of these. So we heard this at normal speed. I'm going to play for you at half speed. Here you can hear the echoes. You can hear how this would work if you were echolocating. Not right there, infrasound. So we've had two elements, or we've had one kind of element and then a different kind of element, and that forms a subphrase. Now repeat. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip to our conclusion. And I do have a whole video on whale song on YouTube, so you can just watch that if you're curious. And it had that stuff at the end of it. So I actually changed the conclusion. We're not talking that much about human music. What I want to talk about instead is animals, music, and intelligence. So humans are animals. We know that, but we kind of forget it. We think of ourselves as different. I guarantee you that whales think of themselves as fundamentally different from all other species of whale, basically. Humpback whales think that they're, unique. We're 99% chimpanzee, 70% fish, 65% bird. We have all this background, like the basis of our psyche and how we relate to sound and how we communicate with others. We have had that for a very long time. So, and we also sometimes think that animals are not intelligent and not sophisticated. And there's a book called Franz de Waal. It's a recent book and it's great. And it's called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? There is a pattern that happens, and he brings this out, but it's really something that happens, which is the more we learn about animals, the more we recognize, oh, they're so much smarter than we thought. It's like it takes us a while to figure out what channel to listen to them on. So that example of the bird song where there's the recordings from the two different Siriuses, and you listen to it at 1/10 the speed. Before you do that, you just think, okay, it's just whistling, who cares? But when you slow it down the right amount, when you basically look under the microscope, the auditory microscope, in the right way, you can see both like really incredible complexity and also just brilliance and like musical intelligence, right? The more we learn about animals, the more we learn how much they have to teach us, including how much they can teach us about music. And this little picture at the bottom left it's a podcast that I heard, and it was just mind-blowing to me. This is a guy who does a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI. He's a SETI researcher, and he was saying when we're listening for from intelligent life signals from space, we kind of do things like listen for the digits of pi or other things or languages. But if what we should do is survey all the different intelligent life forms on Earth and see if the method we have for figuring out if they're intelligent, work for the life forms that we do have here. And he goes into detail on how all these different kinds of intelligent communication systems, and that even include plants, that I was so surprised about, but it's real. Plants communicate with insects in complex ways. So he goes into how dolphin language is as complex as human language, and they seem to learn in the same way that babies do. And it just has taken us a very, very, very long time to be able to listen in a way that we can appreciate that. And when it comes to humpback whales, he says like their singing is slightly lower complexity than dolphin speech, basically dolphin communication. But he also says something fascinating, which is like if you took the lyrics of human songs, you would probably find that our human lyrics are a little bit less complex than human speech generally. And so humpback whales do have a very sophisticated life and communication system, but if their music might be a little tiny bit less complex in those ways, but it probably is more complex in other ways, like the musical ways. And I think that we do have a lot that we can learn from about music and the arts and ourselves from other animals. And that's all I have. Thank you so much. If you want, please feel free to email me.
We had more time, but again, thanks for inviting the students to ask questions. I know I've got some. One quick question. In the article, it talked about the whales share a song in the community, but they sing it out of phase with each other. Does anybody have any idea how they learn it then? Because if everybody's singing, but it's not coordinated, I mean, that itself is quite a feat.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think I figured it out. I didn't mean to figure it out, but I was like, talking to my students, and I was like, oh, that's it. So there's two ways of thinking about whales too. One of them, so whales have been the same for the last 15 million years. Like they haven't changed genetically, really. But sometime within that last 15 million years, there was maybe like an ice age or something like that, some sort of change, and there was where they how they used to migrate. They in the winter they're at the poles. No, sorry, in the summer they're at the poles eating, and in the winter they go to the geography changed at some point, and they had to like start using calling in order to communicate, to like say, hey, this is where the party is, this is where the party is. So that can make, that's why I called it like Whale-a-Palooza, or it's like maybe like Coachella or the Rainbow Gathering that isn't announced until the last minute where exactly it's going to be. It's like there's a festivals in a new place each year, and it's not announced exactly where it's going to be until that moment. But then once it's announced, they advertise to try to say, hey, we have these songs and these singers here. And whale songs are so low that they can go, I think they can go from the tropics all the way to the poles. I'm not 100% sure about that. It seems crazy. I think that is possible with the very, very, very low sound, low powerful sounds. So there's that aspect. And then there is also, so the one aspect is the Coachella or something like that, or Whale-Palooza. But the other aspect is like all states. All state is something for musicians, like high school students will all come to our building and they all playing the same piece, and they'll go to different rooms for different judges. They all play the same piece, but they go in their separate rooms and get judged on it individually. So that's very similar to what's happening in the lek. The males go and they start singing in the same sort of area near breeding grounds, and females can go and listen to each individual one. And since they're not singing all at the same time in a chorus, it's basically like going to different audition rooms and listening to the individual. They're all being judged based on the same song. And that song tells not just how good they are at that song acoustically, but also that whale's culture, who they've learned from, what festivals they've been at in the past. Those sorts of things. I think it's that combination of forces that explains the complexity of the evolution of the whale song, the individuality at the same time that they're singing the same song, but they're doing it individually.
And I know students, if you have to go, please go. They may have other classes, but one last question. So for humans, in a lot of cultures, not universally, we have a clear distinction between language and music. And we know one is one and one is the other, for the most part, you know? And when somebody is singing with lyrics, we say, oh, that's the two of them together. Are there examples of other animals where there is both something that would be more called language and versus something that would be more called music?
Yeah.
Or
the answer is yes. And like these two questions that you're asking, they're so perfect. I would be like if I told you what questions to ask. They're so good. So the zebra finch example I gave you, I wanted to give that because it actually gives, it's a simple animal in a sense. It gives you this distinction between what is song and what is speech. And it's weird. Zebra finch is like studied almost exclusively for its song. But what those scientists, the particular ones I was showing you, they said they wanted to listen to all of the different social calls that the zebrafish has because they want to sort of ask that question a bit. And one way of thinking about like what music is for humans, music versus speech, we quantize our pitches. Like instead of going, we go, we break them up into discrete parts. And the same thing with our rhythms. We don't go, we go, but with timbre in music, it's continuous. It's all those things can kind of be the same thing. We don't say on the page what timbre something is supposed to be. With speech, it's exactly the opposite. You say the specific timbre, the consonant and the vowel. You don't say how the melody is supposed to go of the speech or the rhythm. So speech and music use the same three things, rhythm, pitch, and timbre, but which ones are syntactical, which ones are discrete, are opposite. So but they then look at the Zebra Finch song and other vocalizations, and the song is very stereotyped and it's always the same. Those other vocalizations, the pitch height that they're using doesn't matter, and the rhythm that they're using doesn't really matter. It's the timbres themselves. And then I can't remember exactly how it works with the song, but the song is so stereotyped anyway that it's functioning as repeating the same thing over and over. So it is much more that their song is like a song. Their different vocalizations that are not song are really like speech in that what matters is timbre. The pitch doesn't matter and the rhythm doesn't matter in that sense. And then there's one other example of this, which is in baboons. They recently found this. People are always saying that humans can speak because of the descended hyoid bone, but all the way back to baboons, like they're related to us like 30,000 years ago. And those baboons have 5 different vowels. They use there's the larynx, and there's this tube, and there's this tube, and those create your 2 formants. And baboons have 5 different vowels that they are sculpting with those same 2 tubes as well. So that isn't song exactly, but it's showing that they are using language like the same things that we use to change the timbre of sounds to communicate. They're doing that same thing.